Name of the Wind is a 2007 fantasy novel by Patrick Rothfuss. It is followed up by another book called The Wise Man's Sphere. These books and the as of yet unpublished Doors of Stone make up a trilogy known as the Kingkiller Chronicle. There are two spin-off pieces of shorter fiction, Slow Regard of Silent Things and The Lightning Tree. Rothfuss spent 14 years working on the first draft of the whole series and editing Name of the Wind. This book review will cover the first book only. This epic fantasy novel is set in the world of Temerant and tells the story of an epic hero named Kvothe who has run away from all of his problems and settles down in a small town named Noir and becomes an innkeeper with his apprentice Bast. Then, one night, a spider monster, which is actually a fae, attacks a villager near the inn, and they get rid of its body with fire and iron. The villagers don't know what it is, but Kvothe does, and he's undercover, and he doesn't want to be known for the epic hero he really is. Later on, a scholar named the Chronicler, which is actually what the book calls him. He has a real name, Devin Lochis. I'm gonna call him that because that's a better name than the Chronicler. Um, Devin is in the business of writing down famous people's stories. He is saved from another spider fae monster in the woods by Kvothe, and he realizes that it is indeed Kvothe because Lochis is such an educated scholar. Offers to write down Kvothe's entire life story, and Kvothe agrees on the condition that Lochis will write down literally everything Kvothe says perfectly and will not change a thing. This story Kvothe will tell over the course of 3 days. Each book in the trilogy will take place as one of those 3 days. Most of the book takes place in the format of Kvothe telling his life story in first person, with the occasional interruption by Bast or Kvothe, or some of the villagers, who sometimes show up. Kvothe starts telling his life story by telling us about his upbringing among the Ademaru, traveling culture of people who put on plays and like music and song and such. His father is the leader of their troupe. At one point, they meet an arcanist, this world's version of a wizard, named Abinthy. Abinthy is my second favorite character, and he hangs out with them for a while, does things for the troupe, and he teaches Kvothe a bunch of science, like chemistry and mathematics and other things like that, and a little bit of magic called sympathy. But Kvothe, they've been together in the same troupe for, I think, around a few years at this point, and Kvothe wants to learn more magic. He wants to learn the name of the wind. Abinthy refuses to teach him, so Kvothe, who is like 11 at this point in his story, almost kills himself by using sympathy and magic and trying to control the wind. After that point, Abinthy refuses to teach him any more magic, just chemistry and math. Then, eventually, Abinthy leaves the troupe, and months after that, his father, Arliden, is writing a song about some fairy tale boogeymen called the Chandrian. And the actual Chandrian come out of nowhere and murder his entire troupe except for Kvothe. Young Kvothe sneaks out into the woods and just sort of survives for a few months. He plays his father's lute to himself to entertain himself, and at some point, most of the lute strings are broken, and he goes to the near large city of Tarbeon, and his lute is almost instantly stolen and broken on the first day. Kvothe lives homeless in this city for a few years. Lots of things occur, some bad, some good, some exciting. After about 2 years, he decides that he wants to pursue his education further. So he pawns his sole possession, a book, that was given to him by Abinthy, and he goes up to the university along the road. And on his way, he meets a girl named Denna, and they're sort of in like a relationship for like 3 days, and then like another guy shows up, and then like they're not really anymore. But it was kind of like they didn't really communicate that well in the first place. But Kvothe is still pretty angry, and he goes to the university, and he gets in to the university for -3 silver coins because he cheats on the entrance exam. And the professors also know who his dad is because his dad was famous. Kvothe goes to sympathy magic class the next day, and turns out he already knows everything the class will teach, since it's just basics of sympathy, and he already learned it from Abinthy. And so, the next day, Master Hem, the teacher, allows him to do a demonstration of his powers. And because Kvothe doesn't really like Master Hem, Kvothe uses his sympathy magic to essentially make a small, very limited voodoo doll, and then poke it in the foot with like a poker, and then it singes Master Hem's foot. Kvothe is put on trial by the university, because they are literally the government at the university, and they decide that he shouldn't be kicked out, but he's gonna get whipped, because Master Hem was essentially begging for that by allowing him to do that, by giving him his hair to make the doll, and like, because Master Hem just essentially didn't expect for Kvothe to do that, so they just have him be whipped. And he also gets promoted in the university hierarchy to the next like degree, kind of, because he proved that he knew sympathy, which was what you needed to get to that level. And this means he also gets access to the more important books in the library, which was one of his main motivations for going to the university, because then he can learn more about the Chandrian and maybe get his revenge at some point. Before he gets whipped, he gets high so that he can resist the pain of the whipping. He gets whipped. He goes to the infirmary, gets bandaged up. Then he goes to the library, still high. The librarian on duty is another student named Ambrose, who kind of doesn't like him, mostly just because Ambrose is kind of annoying, and because he's an annoying noble's son, and that's what noble's son do. And he charges Kvothe a silver coin for a candle so he can see in the dark expanse of the library. Turns out, it's illegal for Kvothe to have fire in the library, and Ambrose was just playing a prank on him, as he could have just given him a free magical sympathy lamp. Kvothe is permanently banned from the library by Master Archivist Lauren. Lots of shenanigans occur, including Kvothe meeting Denna again, Kvothe getting a bunch of friends, Kvothe trying and failing to learn the name of the wind from the elusive and eccentric Master Namer Elodin. Kvothe succeeds at becoming an artificer under Master Kilvin. He goes to bars and sings a whole bunch and gets a lute. He goes into debt. The book is very rambly at times, and eventually Kvothe gets attacked by his now rival, Ambrose, his goons, of course, because Ambrose would never do the dirty work himself. And Kvothe uses fire and wind to sort of repel them, and Kvothe's lute gets hurt and destroyed. And so Kvothe gets a horse and rides off somewhere for a while and hangs out with Denna. And there's a dragon cow, and they set a bunch of things on fire, but no one dies, and they sort of just mess around. And then he goes back to the city, and Ambrose puts Kvothe on trial, and Kvothe puts Ambrose on trial for breaking his lute, and sort of there's a big trial scene at the end, really the climax of the book, and Ambrose has to pay for the lute breaking and stealing, so he pays twice over because there's a loophole. And Kvothe, who attacked Ambrose earlier, would here be kicked out. But since he's learned naming, he's unlocked the name of the wind, Elodin appeals to him, and Kvothe just gets whipped a whole bunch instead. And so Kvothe is promoted to the next university level, and he now knows the name of the wind. That's sort of where Kvothe's story bit ends in this book. But throughout the book, of course, there's lots of interruptions, and at the end, Bast, Dr. Lochies is going to sleep, Dr. Lochies being the chronicler, and Bast sort of is very protective of him, and he tells him that a bunch of threats, and says that if he ever sort of tries to harm Kvothe, that Bast will really get him. And that's really where the story ends. Outer art elements. So its position as good is rather controversial, as well as being widely praised. It's also quite popular on YouTube, as lots of book reviewers on YouTube talk about it, especially those who often review fantasy novels. Although the opinions on YouTube are far more diverse than those on Goodreads, as they usually are. Most people who dislike this book dislike Kvothe, specifically, and often accuse him of being a Mary Sue, and lots of people who, even those who dislike the book, like the prose of the book, while those people who strongly like this book are more likely to like the main character and to not say anything about the prose. There's also a frequent debate over the matter of trusting Kvothe. Is Kvothe an unreliable narrator or not? Some people who deeply like the book would say that he is, in fact, an unreliable narrator, and that's why he has done all these sort of magnificent feats, while usually the argument against this is that it doesn't matter whether he's an unreliable narrator or not, it's still bad writing. Now let's talk about the book's actual structure and plot, which it's actually very complicated, although that doesn't necessarily mean it's quite good. In this story, there's the framing device, and then there's the actual story. Kvothe's story. But Kvothe's story is definitely the main thing people are reading. If you look at all of the Goodreads reviews, actually a whole bunch of them, not all of them, but a lot of them, and not even most, but a lot of them, barely even refer to the frame story. A lot of them just talk about, like, the main story, partially because that's most of the text, and partially because not much significant actually happens in the frame story. But anyways, it's the most important part. Let's talk about the actual story first, Kvothe's story. If you've read the book, you'll notice that it doesn't actually seem to have, like, a main plot. There's just Kvothe. There's just Kvothe's character arc, really. Kvothe growing and Kvothe becoming more powerful and getting closer to his goals, or at least something like that. And there's lots of little stories he's in. And all of these little stories are all tied together by Kvothe. But there's no big story other than Kvothe. There's just his character arc. He is at the center of the most important thing. Now here is where I'm going to point out that I think story Kvothe and frame Kvothe are very different things. As story Kvothe does a lot, he's very young, he's very abrasive, and theoretically he will eventually become frame Kvothe. But they're really different characters because story Kvothe is much more important and there's a lot more emphasis on him and he does things, whereas frame Kvothe is kind of sad and he saves one guy, the chronicler, and he ultimately just sort of creates this story. That's really his purpose, is to tell the actual story, to facilitate the actual story that was being told. So there are really two Kvothe characters. In fact, Frame Kvothe kind of really doesn't do much, and he really kind of exists in the form of Bast sort of observing him and sort of obsessing over him, because Bast is very, very protective and of Kvothe. So really, he's just sort of like a thing being observed by Lo'Cheese and Bast, creating the important thing that we really care about the most. Another thing that's quite curious about Frame Kvothe is that a lot of people accuse him of being an unreliable narrator, although this is kind of interesting given that the actual story is the most important bit. So really, the main meat of the book, hypothetically, if Kvothe is unreliable, then really the whole main story is the whole main thing that we really care about is sort of like sort of a hoax, right? And there's sort of like, I think that would be very problematic for fans of the series to claim, because they care about this thing so much, and they're like, yeah, it just sort of doesn't like it's just sort of fake, you know? In fact, in the story, there are actually alternative versions of Kvothe's story, spread by Cobb, who's one of the villagers. He doesn't realize Kvothe is a bartender, but for him, Kvothe is like sort of like a legend, and he tells the story of Kvothe, who goes to the university at age 10 and is paid. He's paid a whole sack of gold coins, and he lives in this random widow's house. You know, could have happened. We just couldn't know, because Kvothe, what if he's an unreliable narrator? Oh. I would also point out that most people do not consider Kvothe an unreliable narrator, which to me, I think that really makes him kind of a Mary Sue, which is usually considered poor writing. There's a very good video essay by Overly Sarcastic Productions that sort of defines a Mary Sue. There's a link in the description. To her, a Mary Sue is someone who the whole story just sort of warps around them with no respect to the established rules, and it usually results in an overly powerful and overly liked character that we don't really have a reason for caring about them. Now, if we look at this hypothetical Kvothe of the non-lying Kvothe, of Frame Kvothe, then he definitely meets all of those characteristics, and I think maybe Story Kvothe is less of a Mary Sue, because I think you can sort of care about him a little bit because he's just like a young kid for much of the story, and so it makes a lot more sense to care about him, although he still sort of like essentially warps reality, the rules, pre-established rules around him, and everything just sort of ends up in his favor, and a lot of characters are either for Kvothe or radically against Kvothe, as if it was just like, because like Ambrose doesn't really have a reason for like wasting all that time to spike Kvothe, except for Kvothe is kind of annoying to him, so like Ambrose is just ruining this random guy's life for no reason, and it's just, a lot of characters are just like hold grudges against Kvothe for like so long, and then some characters are just like friends with Kvothe, and it's sort of like, wow, the whole world is against Kvothe, guys, or they're totally for Kvothe, and it's sort of, it's like good guys, bad guys, and good guys are just Kvothe team, and bad guys are just guys who don't like Kvothe. I think that's pretty, by the definition that overly sarcastic production uses, that would definitely be a Mary Sue, assuming Frame Growth is not lying, because that would make sense. Also, Frame Growth would be a Mary Sue, because essentially, I think we're pretty much supposed to agree with Bast that Kvothe is cool, because, like, Bast is kind of obsessed with Kvothe, but then we're not really even supposed to see that as, like, a bad thing, that he's just radically obsessed with Kvothe. We're supposed to see it as a good thing, because Kvothe is sort of, like, all good and stuff. And so, I think that really Frame Kvothe, we're not really taught to like him or care about him, so he's just essentially like just like this edgy guy, and like I guess you could kind of care about him by extension of caring about Story Kvothe, although I think there's a lot less there. Now, the plot of Name of the Wind is a lot less interesting to me from a review perspective. I think that reading some of them are very fun. Like, there's all these little stories that happen, and there's, like, a lot of things. Except the spider, demon, fairy, monster thing plot was dumb, and I kind of, like, don't know... Like, I know it's going to be important in the later books, but, like, it was kind of not fun. Like, I didn't like that. And I was kind of not invested in it because I dislike Frame Kvothe. The other characters, I think there are some better ones, because I really liked Abinthy, Master Namer Elodin, and Auri. Some of the other masters were okay. I thought Manit, the old guy, I liked him a lot. The rest of his friends were pretty boring and forgettable. I think Rothfuss just sort of put them in there because he wanted Kvothe to have friends. Like I don't know. And I think Ambrose is literally nonsense. I've already talked about how he's kind of just like a babyish rival who's kind of like exists to put problems in Kvothe's way so he can solve them to make Kvothe look cool, I guess, because like he's just like a plot thing. He really just exists to serve the plot. And I think Master Hem is just sort of a scaled down version of that because he's not insane or rich. And I think the chronicler, Mr. Devin Lochis, was kind of fun. I wish we saw more of him though. Denna is literally almost worse than Kvothe for writing wise. She didn't have a character at all. She exists solely as a love interest for Kvothe. I think a lot of the female characters in this story kind of just exist as like just for the men. Like, and I think that's pretty poor writing. My favorite thing about this book, and the reason why I actually cared enough to review it, was really the prose. Actually, the prose is actually, it's not like ugly prose, but it's not pretty. But I think it's perfect for this book because it's crystal clear, and I can just sort of I don't have to stop and like read. I can just keep on going because I can sort of just directly like imagine it almost perfectly. Like, the descriptions are wonderfully written, and it just sort of flows into my mind like right immediately. There's no muddled descriptions, and yet the language is still is still not like, it's not like beautiful glass hiding the story. It's like it's not like muddy glass hiding the story. It's like perfect crystal clear glass, and you know exactly what is happening. This works especially well with the world building of the story, which I think the world building is kind of fairly generic at parts, but I think some of the details and some of the nice elements, it sort of feels like very nice to read the world, about the world, and about the cities, and about the things, because it's so well described and you can imagine it very vividly, and you can sort of like imagine how the magic like plays out, and I think the descriptions of the characters are also quite good. Um, and I think that it is probably, if you're gonna do a generic fantasy world, you want to have good prose to describe it in. I just went on a walk, a very good walk, mind you, and time to get back to this. So now, time for the actual review portion of the review, where I tell you how good I think it will be. It is. As you can see, I've written up what I think of each art element up on the board, and then I've averaged them. Well, obviously some art elements way more. For example, Story Kvothe is more important than Frame Kvothe, as you can see by the ×4, and then I've averaged all of the out of 10 scores of all of the elements, and then so I really think that this book is kind of deeply average with a 4.938. And I think that I agree with book reviewer James Tullis that in fact this book is not bad, but it is deeply overrated. If the third book, if or when it comes out, I will probably review and read the whole series, as well as the spin-offs, because I really want to see Kvothe Kill a King, because it's the name of the series.